When Jenny and Mark first saw this house, they immediately felt they had found what they were looking for. Secluded, quaint, and surrounded by thick woods, it looked perfect for their new chapter of life. Large windows, a massive wooden door, and slightly faded paint gave the building a distinctive charm. "The perfect place for inspiration," Jenny said, her voice shaking with joyful anticipation. She could already picture herself sitting by the window with a cup of tea and the lines of her novel falling onto paper. Mark, the architect, was also delighted. The house, with its carved columns and ancient brickwork, looked like a work of art, arousing admiration and professional interest. But once they were settled in, the strange things began to happen. The first night, Jenny couldn't sleep. The wind rustled outside the window, and the old wooden staircase seemed to creak under the footsteps of unseen guests. She listened, her heart beating faster. "It's just old wood," she whispered to herself, trying not to wake Mark. But in the morning, her first warning awaited her. On the kitchen table lay a note. "We're watching." Mark, of course, laughed. "It's probably a realtor or neighbor joke. You know how weird people's senses of humor are." But his smile quickly faded when he saw Jenny go pale. The neighbors, if there were any, remained invisible. Their windows were closed, their yards empty. The atmosphere grew more and more oppressive. On the third night, Jenny awoke to the sensation that someone was looking at her. She opened her eyes and froze. Outside their bedroom window, amidst the thick darkness, something was reflecting the light of the moon, like eyes, big, round, studying. She felt her hands cover with cold sweat. She woke Mark. "Look, there's someone there." But when he looked out the window, there was no one there. "Probably a reflection," he said, but you could hear the doubt in his voice. Jenny noticed how his gaze became more wary than he was trying to show. The next day, Mark noticed that one of the windows in the attic was open. "Must be the wind. I'll fix it tomorrow." But when he went up to the attic, he found that the window wasn't just open. It looked like someone had smashed it from the inside. On the floor lay another note: "You shouldn't be here." His hands trembled as he picked it up. One night, Jenny sat in her workroom. She tried to concentrate on the text, but the creaking of floorboards in the hallway disrupted her thoughts. Her heart pounded faster. "Mark?" she called out, but there was no answer. She stepped out into the hallway and saw that the door to their bedroom was ajar. Jenny slowly walked over and peered inside. There on the wall was a new drawing. A large eye had been drawn with a black charcoal line. It seemed to be watching her. Her legs gave out, and she clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Over the weekend, Mark decided to explore the basement, which they hadn't touched until now. It smelled damp and old bricks. The flashlight picked out ancient dust-covered shelves and drawers from the darkness. Among the junk, he found a wooden box with an old diary inside. The entries began in 1903. They spoke of how the house was more than just a building. "It watches everyone who dares to enter. It feeds on their fear and locks them inside itself. No one leaves, no one." The last entry broke off with the words, "He watches through the windows. Don't look back." Mark felt a chill wash over him. At that moment, the basement door slammed shut with a clatter. He heard something heavy walking on the floor upstairs. As he went upstairs, he realized that Jenny hadn't heard him. That night, Jenny woke up to whispering. She went to the window and saw all the windows of the house across the street, reflecting the moonlight like eyes. They were looking at their house. Suddenly, there was a reflection in her window too, but it was not her own. It was a face, grim, unfamiliar. "You shouldn't have come in," it whispered, and her heart sank. Mark, trembling, showed Jenny the diary. They decided to leave. Gathering their things, they headed for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were locked as well. Their attempts to get out continued into the morning. The more they tried, the more the house resisted. The floorboards bent, the walls whispered, the windows reflected their faces that moved on their own. Jenny screamed, "Why won't you let us go?" And then a voice sounding from everywhere at once said, "Because you are my new story." The next day, the house looked as peaceful as ever. A "for sale" sign appeared on its porch, and inside, in the dark window, it looked as if someone's face had flashed. It was late evening outside when Haley closed her laptop and stretched. She was working from home, and the long hours at the screen were exhausting. The apartment was quiet. Just the occasional traffic noise outside the window was a reminder that somewhere out there life was still going on. Haley glanced at her phone. 23:17. Time to go to bed, she thought, but before she did, she decided to make herself a cup of tea to calm her nerves. The kitchen was in semi-darkness. The only source of light was the screen of her phone, which lit the way. As she waited for the water to boil, her gaze fell involuntarily on the window opposite. It was an old house similar to her own. A dim yellow light shone through the window, but nothing out of the ordinary. Haley, not knowing why, lingered her gaze on that window. A silhouette flashed behind the curtain. She squinted, trying to get a closer look. The figure was barely visible, but it was definitely human. It could have been anyone, a neighbor, a random passerby, or someone cleaning the room. Yet something about the movement made her skin goosebumps. The silhouette stood motionless. "It's showing," she said quietly to herself and turned away. The kettle boiled, and Haley hurried to distract herself. After a moment, however, she looked out the window again. The silhouette was closer now, clearer. A woman, tall, with long hair covering half her face. She was looking directly at Haley. The woman's eyes were barely visible, but something about them was wrong. Too black, like black holes. Haley froze. "Why is she looking at me?" she thought. But after a moment, the light in that window went out. The apartment became uncomfortably quiet. Haley felt her hands shaking, but she quickly found an explanation for her fear. "It's just the neighbor. I'm winding myself up," she thought. Making tea, she went back to her bedroom and tried not to look at the window. The next evening, it happened again. This time, the woman stood at the window with a start. She was looking at Haley again. She tried to ignore her, but it was getting harder with each look. Haley tried to convince herself that it was just some weird neighbor joke, but something inside her told her it wasn't a joke. That night was the first time she heard a sound, a quiet tapping, like someone drumming lightly on the glass with their fingers. She held her breath, trying not to move. The sound repeated. Haley barely dared to look at the window. It was empty, but she thought she saw something flicker behind it like a shadow. She couldn't sleep until morning. Haley began to notice the woman every night. Sometimes she stood still, sometimes she moved closer to the glass. One day Haley waved, hoping the strange neighbor would just answer her, but she just froze. Her head tilted slightly to the side, and then the light in the window went out. Haley felt a cold sweat cover her back. She couldn't explain why this woman was so disturbing to her, but every night the fear grew stronger. A few days later, on her way back from a walk, she decided to look in the entryway of that house. Her curiosity overpowered her fear. Haley entered the building, but it was quiet and empty inside. The old-fashioned hallway smelled damp, and the walls were peeling. She went up to the floor from where she always saw the woman. When she reached the door, however, she realized that no one had lived behind it for a long time. The apartment was boarded up. She left, trying to forget that moment. But at night, she heard the knocking again. This time it sounded louder. Haley opened her eyes and froze. The woman wasn't standing in the window across the hall. She was at her window. Her long hair hid most of her face, but Haley could see her mouth a crooked, pained smile. The woman slowly raised her hand and knocked. Haley recoiled, dropping her phone. She wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. When she looked up, the woman was gone. That night, Haley didn't sleep. She started looking for information about the house across the street. Old forums and archival articles told her of a strange story. Years ago, a family had lived here and had suddenly disappeared. The only person found was their oldest daughter, dead, with her face contorted. Haley felt a chill sweep over her. The description of the girl matched what she'd seen. The next night, Haley decided not to go near the window. She pulled back the curtains, turned on all the lights in the apartment, and tried to distract herself with soap operas. But the knocking came again and again, louder, closer. She felt something inside the house change. The air felt heavier. The walls seemed to move. When she turned to the window, the curtains were pulled back. The woman was looking at her with the same crooked smile. Her fingers slid slowly across the glass. Haley couldn't take it anymore. She ran out of the apartment, leaving the door open. Her heart was beating so hard she couldn't feel her legs. She ran down the street without looking back. It wasn't until the end of the block that she dared to stop. When she looked back, she saw the same smile flashing through her own window. Haley never went home again, but every time she passed a new house, she wondered if there was someone waiting for her outside one of the windows. I've always loved a quiet weekend away from the hustle and bustle of the city, so my girlfriend's suggestion to go to a coastal town to get away from everything seemed perfect. A small town with a few hundred residents, the sound of the sea and the smell of salt in the air, it was just right. But I had no idea that this trip would change our lives. From the very beginning, the locals looked at us strangely, as if we had done something wrong. But it wasn't displeasure in their looks, but rather a warning. When we asked the hotel owner what was worth visiting here, he hesitated, but then reluctantly said, "The lighthouse, but you'd better stay away from it. There are strange stories associated with it." These words only piqued our curiosity. That same night we went out for a walk to the shore. The lighthouse was perched on a cliff, its silhouette looming against the starry sky. But what was strange, the lighthouse's flame was lit and extinguished, although according to the locals it had long been abandoned. The next day we decided to get closer. The road to the lighthouse turned out to be overgrown and almost impassable, but after overcoming the obstacles we reached its base. The entrance was open as if someone was waiting for us. Inside we were met with dust and desolation, but something compelled us to climb the creaky wooden steps. At the very top, we found an old diary. Its cover was faded and the pages yellowed. It was the diary of a lighthouse keeper, a man who, he said, had not only watched the sea, but had seen something unexplainable. He wrote about strange shadows that appeared in the night, voices he heard in storms, and lights that flickered by themselves as if someone or something was trying to signal. "I know I'm crazy, but every night I see their silhouettes on the shore. They're calling out to me. If I don't respond, they'll come for me," was how the last recording ended. Suddenly we heard a noise, as if someone was coming up the stairs. At first we thought it was the wind, but the footsteps were too distinct. We froze, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped, and silence fell heavy on us. I slowly looked out of the room, but no one was there. At night, we could not sleep. It seemed as if someone was watching outside the windows of our room. In the morning, we decided to go back to the lighthouse to find out what was going on. But when we got there, the entrance was boarded up. "You were there at night, weren't you?" one of the locals asked when we told him what had happened. His face turned pale. "No one enters the lighthouse. It's impossible. It's been locked for years." Those words made us doubt our own memories. But the diary I found was in my backpack. It was the real proof that we were there. In the days that followed, we began to notice strange things. Our phones would run out of power as we approached the lighthouse. In the evenings, we were haunted by the feeling that someone was watching. At night, we heard muffled voices and saw the lighthouse light flashing in the distant gloom. We didn't know what it meant, but one thing was certain: the lighthouse wouldn't let us go. One night I ventured back to the lighthouse alone. I didn't want to drag my girlfriend into it, but as I got closer, I saw shadows slithering around its base. They weren't human. Their movements were too fast and indistinct. I froze with fear, but then I heard the same voice described in the diary. It was calling my name. I don't remember going back. The only thing I remember is the cold that penetrated to my bones and the feeling that I had left something important behind. We left that town the next day, but the lighthouse didn't let us go. Its lights continue to flicker in my dreams, and its voice calls me back. And every time I see the lighthouse in a photograph or in a movie, I catch myself thinking, what if I went back? What if solving this mystery is my destiny? I've always found the job of a night bus driver boring but relaxing. Usually my passengers were tired office workers, students with loud headphones, sometimes couples coming home after a date. The city outside my windows seemed lifeless, as if the night was freezing everything around me. I was used to the routine, and over the years, few things could surprise me anymore. But everything changed that night. He showed up, like so many other passengers, at one of the downtown stops. A tall, thin man in a long black hooded jacket. I noticed him as soon as he entered. His movements were smooth, almost silent. He was walking toward the back rows, as if he were looking for his permanent seat. Something about his gait caught my attention, an unnatural lightness, as if he were gliding across the floor rather than walking. I followed him through the mirror until he settled by the window. His face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, and there was no way I could make him out. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. After all, there are often strange people on night flights. However, when I reached the final stop, I found that he was gone. This struck me as odd since I hadn't let anyone out. The doors only open when the bus comes to a complete stop. I looked all over the interior, but found no trace of him. The only thing that reminded me of his presence was a slightly damp seat. The next night he reappeared. Same stop, same time. He walked silently to his seat and sat by the window. I noticed again how quietly he moved. This time I decided to watch him more closely. Every time I looked in the mirror, he was there. However, by the time the bus reached the terminus, he had disappeared again. Now it became not just an oddity, but a mystery. I began to think that perhaps it was some sort of hallucination of mine or the effects of fatigue. But something inside me told me it wasn't. On the third night, I decided to talk to him. As soon as he sat down in his seat, I plucked up the courage to approach him. "Good evening. Is everything all right?" I asked, trying not to show my excitement. He turned his head slowly, but his face remained hidden in the shadows. The silence was too loud, too pressing. I felt a chill run down my spine. He nodded slightly but didn't say anything. I returned to my seat, feeling my heart beating faster than usual. The next night, I told one of my co-workers about it. His reaction was unexpected. He listened carefully, then frowned. "Are you sure this isn't a joke?" he asked. I nodded. There was an accident on this route. About 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. A man died. He was on his way to the end of the line, but he never got off. This information only made me more anxious. I couldn't leave it at that. That night, when he reappeared, I decided to wait for the terminus and check his seat as soon as the bus stopped. When I approached, the passenger was gone again, but there was a wet piece of paper lying on the seat. On it was written only one word: help. Now I didn't know what to think anymore. I wanted to convince myself that it was just someone's evil joke, but something inside me said it wasn't. This man, whoever he was, wanted something from me. Every night he kept showing up, and I could no longer ignore his presence. Every now and then I noticed strange things. When he got on, the temperature on the bus would drop, even though the heating was on. The passengers sitting next to him would move closer to the exit, clearly uncomfortable, though no one complained. One day on another night flight, I heard whispering. At first I thought it was the radio or the rustling of tires on the wet road, but the sounds were coming from the back row. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice. When I looked back, the passenger was sitting in his seat motionless. The whispering had stopped. At that moment, I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped the bus in the middle of the route and headed for his seat. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling, but I tried not to show my fear. He slowly turned his head again, and this time I could make out his face. Pale, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in years. His lips opened slightly, but instead of words I heard only a muffled whisper. I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to my seat, started the bus, and drove to the terminus without turning around. When I got off, my legs were shaking and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I've avoided night shifts ever since. But even now, when I see an empty bus on the road, I catch myself thinking, is he there? Still waiting?